The dream home I purchased 3 years ago sat at the perfect angle in Oak Ridge Estates, catching morning sunlight across the kitchen windows and offering sunset views from the back patio. The real estate listing had emphasized privacy and tranquility as key selling points. The property backed up to a wooded area on one side and featured a generous yard that wrapped around two sides of the house. The community pool and park facilities were just 2 blocks away via the winding community sidewalk. It was everything I had saved for over a decade to obtain. The first few months were perfect. I planted a garden along the back fence, added bird feeders near the kitchen window, and spent peaceful weekends enjoying my own little slice of suburban paradise. Then one Saturday morning in early spring, I spotted something unusual through the kitchen window. A woman in tennis whites cut directly across my backyard, walking confidently along what appeared to be a faint dirt trail I had never noticed before. I stepped onto my back porch and called out politely, "Excuse me, but this is private property." The woman looked startled momentarily, then waved dismissively. "Everyone uses this path to the pool. It saves 5 minutes." Before I could respond, she continued on her way, disappearing through the back fence gate that I suddenly realized had been left unlatched. That single incident multiplied rapidly over the following weeks. One trespasser became 3, then 10, then a steady stream of neighbors cutting diagonally across my property. The faint trail became more pronounced, eventually transforming into an unsightly dirt path that carved my yard in two. Flowers I had planted were trampled. Bird feeders were knocked over. Occasionally, I would find discarded water bottles or snack wrappers left behind. I placed a polite note at both ends of the impromptu pathway. "Please respect private property. Use community sidewalks. Thank you." The notes disappeared within hours. I tried standing outside during peak usage times, gently explaining to passers-by that this was my private property. Most avoided eye contact and hurried past. Others offered awkward laughs or comments like, "But everyone uses it," or "It has always been this way." The final straw came when I attempted to garden near the pathway one Saturday and counted 37 people crossing my property in a single 3-hour period. Some pushed strollers. Others walked dogs that occasionally left unwelcome deposits. One teenager even rode a bicycle, narrowly missing my tomato plants. That Monday, I decided to visit the community management office to file a formal complaint. The receptionist directed me to speak with the HOA president, Sandra Mitchell, who happened to be in the building. Sandra had been a fixture in neighborhood communications since I moved in. Her name appeared on all official notices. Her face prominently featured in community newsletters. The office she occupied was meticulously decorated with community awards and framed photographs of neighborhood events. Sandra herself matched this polished appearance: expertly highlighted blonde hair, crisp linen outfit, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "So you are the owner of Lot 43, she said, consulting a map on her tablet. "That corner property has always been a key connector for our community. The previous owners understood that." I explained the situation clearly. "People are crossing through my property without permission. It is causing damage and infringing on my privacy. I would appreciate the HOA sending out a notice reminding residents to use the proper community pathways." Sandra's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "That path has been a community tradition for years. It represents the spirit of Oak Ridge Estates, convenience and connectivity." "But it is my private property," I countered, "and there is no easement or right of way indicated in my deed." Her eyes narrowed as she set down her tablet. "Perhaps you do not fully understand our community values. Oak Ridge residents look out for each other by sharing. Being community-minded is what makes this neighborhood special." The conversation continued in circles, with Sandra repeatedly emphasizing tradition and suggesting I should be more accommodating. As I left her office, she called after me with artificial sweetness. "Do try to be a team player. It makes living here so much more pleasant for everyone." That evening, I walked my property line, documenting the damage with photographs. The once lush grass was now a barren dirt highway nearly 2 feet wide. Trampled flowers lay flat against the earth. A discarded juice box leaked sticky liquid near my back patio. The property I had worked so hard to purchase was being treated as public land. And according to Sandra, I should feel grateful for the opportunity to serve my neighbors in this manner. I stood at the center of the dirt path as the sun set, listening to the distant laughter from the community pool. This was not about convenience. This was about respect. This was about property rights, and it was clear that polite requests and reasonable discussions would not resolve the situation. I needed information, documentation, and a strategic plan if I was going to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The county records department occupied the basement level of a government building downtown. The air held the distinctive scent of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner. A bored clerk directed me to a computer terminal where I could search property records, then pointed to rows of filing cabinets for physical documents. Most newer deeds are digitized, but plat maps and original development plans might still be in paper files, she explained without looking up from her crossword puzzle. I spent 3 hours methodically combing through every document related to my property. The deed clearly showed the boundaries of Lot 43, with no easements or public access points marked anywhere across my land. The original development plans for Oak Ridge Estates showed designated community pathways that followed the road system, with an official sidewalk running 2 blocks around the perimeter rather than cutting through my property. On my way out, I photographed every relevant document with my phone. That same afternoon, I called my college friend Marcus, who had become a real estate attorney. We arranged to meet for coffee the following day. Marcus arrived at the cafe in his typical rumpled suit, looking like he had just emerged from a long day in court. "Property disputes are my specialty," he said after hearing my initial description. "Bring out everything you found." I laid out printed copies of the documents and explained the situation in detail. With each new piece of information, Marcus grew increasingly amused. He examined the property survey, running his finger along the clearly marked boundaries. "They have absolutely no right to cross your property," he declared, sliding my deed back across the table. "No easement, no right-of-way, nothing. As the owner, you have every legal right to control access to your land." "But what about this community tradition Sandra keeps mentioning?" Marcus shook his head. "Legally meaningless. Even if people had been cutting through for years, that does not establish a legal right unless they have gone through proper channels to claim an easement by prescription, which would require decades of documented use. And even then, you could contest it." Armed with this information, I made one more stop before heading home. The County Historical Society maintained archives of aerial photographs dating back decades. I requested images of Oak Ridge Estates from before I purchased my home. The archivist helped me locate photos from 5, 10, and 15 years prior. What I discovered was illuminating. In photos from 5 and 10 years ago, a clearly visible fence ran along the exact boundary where trespassers now entered my property. In the 15-year-old photos, the entire area that was now my backyard had been densely planted with shrubs. The traditional pathway Sandra spoke of with such conviction did not exist in any historical image. That evening, I watered my damaged garden, mulling over this new information. My next-door neighbor Tom waved from his patio and walked over to chat about the unseasonably warm weather. After a few minutes of small talk, I carefully brought up the pathway issue. "Oh, that," Tom said, looking uncomfortable. "You know, several of us never used that cut-through until recently. Sandra made a big announcement at last year's pool opening party that you had explicitly agreed to allow neighbors to cross your property." I nearly dropped the watering can. I never agreed to any such thing. Tom looked genuinely surprised. "She told everyone it was part of your community initiation, said you were thrilled to contribute to neighborhood connectivity." He paused, studying my expression. "I take it that conversation never happened." "Not once, not ever." Tom shook his head. "That explains why she has been so insistent about people using that path. After you turned down joining her committee last year, she kept saying the community needed to establish that route before you changed your mind about sharing." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. This was not just random trespassing. Sandra had deliberately encouraged residents to establish a path across my property, fabricating my consent to bolster her authority and create a false sense of community tradition. My frustration transformed into cold determination. This was not just about protecting my property anymore. It was about exposing a calculated campaign of manipulation and lies. The first no trespassing sign was professionally made, clearly visible and respectfully worded. "Private property. Please use community sidewalk. Thank you." I installed it at dawn on a Tuesday, securing it firmly to a wooden post at the entrance point where trespassers most commonly entered my yard. I drove the post 18 inches into the ground, using concrete to ensure stability. By lunchtime, when I returned home from errands, the sign had vanished completely, wooden post and all. I installed a second sign the following morning, this time using metal stakes and security screws. This sign disappeared even faster than the first. Over the next week, I placed 5 more signs at various entry points, each vanishing within hours of installation. The situation had moved beyond casual disrespect into deliberate removal of private property. The solution was obvious: documentation. I ordered a comprehensive security camera system with motion detection and cloud storage capabilities. The installation took a full day, with cameras strategically positioned to cover all entry points and the entire pathway across my property. A small notice, required by state law, indicated that video recording was in progress. The third sign I installed was placed directly in front of my most visible security camera, a decision that provided immediate and shocking evidence. When I reviewed the footage that evening, there was Sandra, HOA president and self-appointed defender of community traditions, approaching my sign with purposeful strides. She looked around quickly, then gripped the metal post with both hands. With surprising strength for someone in linen capris and designer sandals, she ripped the sign from the ground, placing it in the trunk of her luxury SUV before driving away. I watched the footage 3 times, documenting the timestamp and saving multiple copies. The next morning, I sent a polite email to Sandra requesting a brief meeting at my home that afternoon. She agreed with suspicious promptness. Sandra arrived at precisely 4 o'clock, wearing an expression of practiced concern. "I hope this is about removing that unsightly camera from your front yard," she said by way of greeting. "Several board members have expressed concerns about its appearance." I invited her into my living room, where my laptop was open on the coffee table. "Actually, I wanted to discuss something the camera recorded yesterday." The confrontation that followed was electric. I turned the laptop toward her and played the video footage. Sandra's expression transformed from confident authority to frozen shock as she watched herself vandalize my property. When the video ended, her face flushed with what appeared to be equal parts embarrassment and fury. "Those signs violate HOA aesthetic guidelines," she declared, recovering quickly. "As board president, I have authority to remove non-compliant installations." "The HOA guidelines do not override state property laws," I replied calmly. "Removing signs from private property without permission is vandalism. I would prefer to resolve this without involving authorities, but I need the trespassing to stop." Sandra stood abruptly, smoothing her designer pants with trembling hands. "Expect a formal violation notice for both the signs and that camera. Our bylaws are quite clear about unauthorized modifications visible from common areas." True to her word, a certified letter arrived 2 days later. The official HOA violation notice cited obscure bylaw violations regarding non-conforming signage and surveillance equipment placement, threatening escalating fines starting at $500 if the issues were not remedied within 7 days. Attached was a separate document titled Community Access Requirements, which attempted to frame my property as having historical pathway easements. The document bore Sandra's signature, along with 2 other board members. However, I noticed something interesting. The third signature looked hesitant, almost reluctant, with a hastily scrawled name I recognized as Bill Henderson, a retired gentleman who lived near the community entrance. While the official pressure mounted, something unexpected began happening in the neighborhood. The number of people cutting through my yard decreased noticeably. My cameras captured several residents approaching the entry point, noticing the camera, and turning around to use the proper sidewalk. One afternoon, a young mother with a stroller stopped at the edge of my property, looked directly at the camera, and mouthed what appeared to be sorry before turning away. Most surprising were the 3 separate neighbors who approached me directly to apologize. One, a middle-aged man named Robert who lived 2 streets over, explained that he had been using the path for months based on Sandra's assurance that I had explicitly approved it. "She made it sound like you were proud to offer that convenience to the community," he said, looking genuinely embarrassed. "I should have asked you directly." The battle lines were being drawn throughout the neighborhood. Some residents avoided eye contact when I passed them while walking my dog. Others made a point of waving or stopping to chat. The controversy had clearly spread beyond my individual property dispute, becoming a referendum on HOA authority and community governance. As the 7-day deadline approached, I did not remove my cameras or cease documenting trespassers. Instead, I prepared for the next phase of the conflict, knowing that Sandra would escalate her tactics. What I needed was a solution that would respect private property rights while remaining technically compliant with even the most creative interpretation of HOA regulations. I needed a strategic response that would end the trespassing problem once and for all while leaving Sandra and the HOA board with no legal grounds for objection. The solution revealed itself during a midnight research session as I pored over the complete HOA guidelines document. Section 12, subsection C covered landscape modifications in extensive detail. Prohibited items included artificial turf in front yards, vegetable gardens visible from the street, and non-native invasive plant species. However, the guideline explicitly encouraged attractive botanical installations that enhance community aesthetics while supporting local ecosystems. Hedgerows, ornamental grasses, native flowering shrubs. Nothing in the HOA guidelines prevented me from installing extensive decorative landscaping on my property. In fact, such improvements were actively encouraged as long as they adhered to the approved plant list and maintained a manicured, intentional appearance. The concept crystallized in my mind: a beautiful, elaborate garden installation that would technically allow passage, but make it so convoluted and time-consuming that no one would bother using it as a shortcut. A regulatory-compliant labyrinth. I contacted my college friend Eliza the next morning. We had met in a landscape design elective I had taken to fulfill an arts requirement. While I had pursued a business degree, Eliza had transformed her passion for landscape architecture into a successful design firm specializing in sustainable urban installations. Our video chat began with casual catching up, but when I explained my predicament, her initial confusion transformed into delighted mischief. Her eyes lit up with professional interest. So you need a defensive landscape installation that remains technically traversable while discouraging actual use, and it all needs to comply with HOA regulations. Exactly. Something beautiful enough that they cannot object, but frustrating enough that no one would choose to walk through it more than once. Eliza worked quickly. Preliminary sketches arrived in my email the following day. The design was brilliant, a complex arrangement of native shrubs and ornamental grasses, creating a technically passable but frustratingly convoluted path. Anyone determined to cross my property would need to navigate a series of dead ends, doublebacks, and narrowing corridors that required sideways shuffling. I designed it with peak frustration in mind, Eliza explained during our follow-up call. The layout creates the illusion of progressive forward movement while actually leading to decision points that often require backtracking. The human brain finds this particularly aggravating because it violates our sense of spatial efficiency. The plants themselves were strategically selected for both compliance and function. Native butterfly bushes with their broad, dense foliage would create visual barriers. Ornamental grasses growing up to 6 feet tall would form narrow corridors that obscured sightlines to the destination. Flowering perennials would add color and texture while filling gaps between larger installations. Every plant on this list appears in your HOA-approved species document, Eliza confirmed. And I have incorporated proper spacing for growth, irrigation considerations, and seasonal variation. From a technical standpoint, this is simply an elaborate ornamental garden with walkable pathways. I studied the design for hours, measuring it against my property dimensions. The labyrinth would cover the entire diagonal shortcut area, extending slightly beyond to ensure no easy bypass could be created. The layout would require trespassers to walk nearly 4 times the distance of the current straight path, with numerous decision points designed to induce frustration. The next phase required careful preparation. I gathered quotes from 3 landscaping companies, selecting one with experience in HOA communities and a reputation for precise implementation of design plans. Materials would need to be ordered incrementally and delivered to my garage to avoid arousing suspicion. The installation itself would have to be completed rapidly to prevent interference. Most critically, I needed to document meticulous compliance with HOA procedures. I completed the standard landscape modification request form with exact specifications, plant lists, and 2-dimensional drawings. The submission included detailed descriptions of all materials, spacing measurements, and irrigation modifications. Every aspect adhered precisely to HOA guidelines, often citing specific sections and subsections to demonstrate compliance. What the 2-dimensional drawings did not reveal was the psychological impact the 3-dimensional installation would create. On paper, it appeared to be a series of curved garden beds with interconnecting pathways. In reality, it would be a bewildering maze designed to maximize confusion and frustration, all while maintaining technical passability. I submitted the documentation on a Thursday afternoon, knowing that Sandra would likely be busy with her standing hair appointment, based on community newsletter mentions of her weekly schedule. This timing ensured the application would first be reviewed by the General Management Office rather than immediately coming to her attention. The trap was baited with complete regulatory compliance. Every plant was approved. Every measurement met guidelines. Every aspect of the design could be defended with direct references to HOA documentation. If challenged, my position was unassailable from a regulatory perspective, and as my research had confirmed, they had no legal grounds to demand access across my private property. As I finalized arrangements with the landscaping company, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was not a hasty reaction or emotional response. This was a carefully orchestrated solution that would protect my property rights while operating entirely within the system that Sandra had attempted to weaponize against me. The labyrinth would soon become reality, and I could hardly wait to observe the results. The installation team arrived at dawn on Friday of Memorial Day weekend. I had specifically scheduled the work during this 3-day holiday when many residents, including most HOA board members, would be away for vacation. The head landscaper, a taciturn professional named Ray, reviewed the plans with his crew of 8 workers. "Interesting design," was his only comment, though I detected a hint of amusement in his tone. For 3 days, my yard transformed into organized chaos. An excavator prepared the ground where the main hedgerows would be installed. Irrigation specialists laid flexible tubing in precise patterns to support the new plantings. Truckloads of mature shrubs arrived in rapid succession, each carefully positioned according to Eliza's master plan. The workers moved with impressive efficiency, transforming theoretical plans into physical reality with remarkable precision. By Saturday evening, the basic structure was in place. By Sunday afternoon, the primary pathways were defined by chest-high hedges and ornamental grasses. By Monday evening, my property had become unrecognizable, a beautiful, bewildering arrangement of flowering shrubs, tall grasses, and winding paths that twisted back on themselves in confounding patterns. The final touch was subtle landscape lighting that illuminated the pathways just enough to be visible at night without providing clear directional guidance. Standing at my back window, I could no longer see straight through to the other side of my property. Instead, I observed a lush, verdant labyrinth that was both beautiful and purposeful. The landscaping crew departed as the sun set on Monday, leaving behind care instructions and a maintenance schedule. Ray nodded appreciatively at the completed installation. "Never built anything quite like this before," he admitted. "But it looks professional. HOA cannot complain about quality." The first trespasser appeared Tuesday morning, a power-walking woman in designer athletic wear who entered the pathway with confident strides. My security cameras captured her progression through the labyrinth, the initial confusion as paths split in unexpected directions, the growing frustration as she encountered the first dead end, and the ultimate defeat when she emerged 10 minutes later from the same entrance, confusion etching her features. By afternoon, similar scenarios played out repeatedly. A teenager on his way to the pool entered the maze, only to exit 3 minutes later, visibly irritated, choosing to walk around the block instead. A middle-aged man in business casual attire made it halfway through before backtracking repeatedly and eventually leaving. A young couple with a stroller barely made it past the first turn before deciding the effort was not worthwhile. My security cameras captured it all: the bewilderment, the backtracking, the consultations of phone maps that showed a straight line where a labyrinth now stood. From my home office window, I occasionally heard frustrated voices. "Which way now? I think we already passed this bush. This is ridiculous. No one successfully navigated the complete path that first day. The emergency HOA meeting notice arrived by Wednesday afternoon, the language ominously citing disruptive modifications detrimental to community well-being, and a special session scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. I had anticipated this reaction and prepared accordingly, organizing my documentation into a comprehensive binder with tabbed sections for easy reference. The community center buzzed with tension when I arrived 5 minutes before the scheduled start time. Nearly 40 residents had gathered, far more than typically attended regular HOA meetings, according to previous meeting minutes I had reviewed. I recognized faces from security footage, people who had been cutting across my property regularly, now sitting with arms crossed and expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Sandra stood at the podium, a laser pointer in hand and enlarged photographs of my property displayed on a projection screen. Her typically perfect appearance showed subtle signs of strain, slightly smudged mascara, a blouse buttoned incorrectly at the bottom. As the meeting was called to order, she launched immediately into a prepared statement. This emergency session addresses a deliberate attempt to disrupt community access and tradition, she began, her voice carrying an edge I had not heard before. As you can see from these photographs, Lot 43 has installed an obstructive maze specifically designed to prevent reasonable passage along the established community pathway. The laser pointer circled areas of my property as Sandra continued. This installation violates the spirit of our community guidelines and represents a hostile action against neighborhood connectivity that has existed for years. When public comments were invited, several residents spoke in support of Sandra's position. A woman complained that her children now had to walk an extra 10 minutes to reach the pool. A man suggested that my landscaping was deliberately antagonistic and not in keeping with community standards. When my turn came, I approached the podium carrying my binder of documentation. The room fell silent as I opened to the first tabbed section. I would like to address several points with factual information, I began calmly. First, regarding the claim of an established pathway tradition. I displayed the historical aerial photographs showing no path existing prior to my purchase of the property. As you can see, this traditional pathway only appeared after I moved in 3 years ago. I continued methodically through each point, presenting property deed documentation showing no easements or public access requirements. I showed side-by-side comparisons of my landscape installation plans with specific HOA guidelines, demonstrating complete regulatory compliance. I displayed the properly filed and approved modification request forms with date stamps and reception signatures. Finally, I concluded, I would like to address the core legal issue. I presented copies of state property laws regarding trespassing and landowner rights. While I have created an ornamental garden that happens to include walkable pathways, there exists no legal obligation for me to provide passage through my private property. As legal reality dawned on the room, Sandra's composed facade began to crumble. Her face flushed deeply as she attempted to regain control of the meeting. The board reserves the right to reinterpret guidelines when community interests are at stake, she declared, her voice rising noticeably. When Bill Henderson, the reluctant third signatory on the violation notice, raised his hand and asked, "Do we have any actual legal grounds to object to this landscaping?" Sandra's restraint finally shattered. "Of course we do," she nearly shouted, startling several attendees. "We have always had access through that property. Who does he think he is, blocking a path that everyone uses? This is about community. This is about cooperation. This is about respecting how things have always been done in Oak Ridge." Her voice had risen to a pitch that had neighbors wincing, her accusations becoming increasingly personal and unhinged. "He has been difficult from the day he moved in, turning down committee positions, questioning established traditions, causing trouble with his constant rule quoting." The community watched in stunned silence as their HOA president unraveled before them. Board member Henderson finally stood and suggested a 10-minute recess, gently guiding Sandra away from the podium as she continued muttering about community spirit and troublemakers. When the meeting reconvened, the HOA vice president, a calm, older gentleman named Richard, announced that the board would need to consult with their legal counsel before taking any further action regarding my property modifications. The meeting adjourned shortly after, with residents breaking into hushed discussion groups as they departed. I walked to my car feeling multiple eyes on my back, knowing that the neighborhood now viewed me in one of two ways, either as a troublemaker who had disrupted community harmony, or as someone who had finally stood up to overreaching HOA authority. Either way, the landscape of neighborhood politics had shifted permanently, much like the physical landscape of my property. The transformation of neighborhood dynamics following the emergency meeting was immediate and fascinating. My morning walks with my dog revealed a community sharply divided. Some neighbors offered subtle thumbs-up gestures or appreciative nods when they thought no one else was looking. Others deliberately crossed streets to avoid greeting me, their expressions hardening when our eyes met accidentally. The HOA board itself fractured into visible factions. Richard, the vice president who had maintained calm during the meeting, was spotted in deep conversation with Bill Henderson near the community mailboxes, both looking concerned. Another board member, Diane Wilkins, publicly questioned Sandra's handling of the situation during a chance encounter at the local grocery store. "That meeting was not our finest moment," she admitted quietly as we both selected produce. "Some of us have questions about procedure." My mailbox became a barometer of community sentiment. Anonymous notes appeared regularly, some threatening property damage or continued HOA scrutiny, others offering support and legal assistance should I need it. One particularly concerning note suggested that accidents happen to troublemaker properties, prompting me to adjust my security cameras for better coverage of my front yard and driveway. The conflict extended beyond just my maze installation. Coffee gatherings formed in various homes throughout the neighborhood, discussing implications that reached beyond my individual stand against perceived authority. The incident had triggered broader conversations about HOA governance, property rights, and the balance between community standards and individual freedoms. Most surprising was the emergence of Thomas Reynolds, a retired attorney who had lived quietly in the community for over a decade. Thomas had never participated actively in HOA politics, preferring to tend his meticulously maintained rose garden and chat amiably with passing neighbors. Now, he emerged as an unexpected voice of reason and resistance. Thomas organized a Saturday meeting for concerned homeowners at his residence, which 15 families attended in his spacious backyard. I received a hand-delivered invitation 2 days prior, the elegant cardstock suggesting this was not an impulsive gathering, but a carefully considered response to recent events. The meeting revealed a deeper pattern of HOA overreach that had been simmering beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect community. As neighbors introduced themselves and their concerns, stories emerged that painted a troubling picture. Arbitrary enforcement of regulations depending on personal relationships with board members, sudden changes to interpretation of bylaws without proper notification, personal vendettas disguised as regulatory concerns. One woman tearfully described receiving violation notices about her garden gnome collection, only after declining to support Sandra's proposal for increased HOA fees. An elderly gentleman had been fined repeatedly for garbage bins left out too long when he was actually hospitalized. A young family had their request to install a small memorial garden for their deceased child rejected on aesthetic grounds, while a board member's similar installation was rapidly approved. Thomas listened to each account with professional attention before addressing the group. What we are witnessing is not a single incident of overreach, but a pattern of selective enforcement and procedural irregularity that demands attention, he observed. The maze incident has simply brought these issues into sharper focus. While this resistance movement formed, Sandra was not idle. She worked feverishly to maintain control of the narrative and the board. Emergency board sessions were called with increasing frequency, though the agendas remained confidential. Through conversations with sympathetic board members, I learned that Sandra was attempting to amend bylaws to create retroactive rules about sight lines and community passage rights that could potentially affect my installation. Her core supporters became increasingly vocal and visible. Some began photographing my house and yard daily, documenting any potential violations. When I left for work, I occasionally noticed cars slowing as they passed my property, occupants pointing and discussing the maze with animated gestures. One particularly dedicated supporter of Sandra even set up a lawn chair across the street one Saturday, openly taking notes about visitors to my home. The conflict had transformed the physical landscape of my property through the installation of the maze. But more significantly, it had transformed the metaphorical landscape of the community, revealing pathways of power and resistance that had long remained hidden beneath manicured lawns and polite waves. The maze had become both physical reality and perfect metaphor, a complex system of paths, dead ends, and unexpected turns that mirrored the social and political complexity now exposed within Oak Ridge Estates. As tensions escalated, I maintained my position calmly, documenting every interaction and ensuring continued compliance with all legitimate HOA regulations. My property remained immaculately maintained, the maze itself evolving into a genuinely beautiful garden installation as plants matured and flowers bloomed. Those who had supported Sandra's position were often surprised when passing my property to discover not an eyesore of defiance, but one of the most attractive landscaping installations in the neighborhood. The struggle had moved beyond my individual property rights to become a referendum on governance, transparency, and the proper limits of HOA authority. As summer progressed toward fall, both sides prepared for the annual HOA election that would determine the future direction of our community. Sandra campaigned aggressively for re-election, while Thomas emerged as an unexpected challenger for the presidency, running on a platform of reasonable governance and procedural transparency. The stage was set for a resolution that would affect not just my property, but the entire community's understanding of neighborhood authority and individual rights. The letter from the HOA's legal counsel arrived exactly 3 months after the maze's completion. The envelope, made of heavy cream-colored paper with the law firm's embossed logo, sat in my mailbox like a formal surrender document. Inside, printed on expensive letterhead, was a carefully crafted 5-page assessment that acknowledged, in precise legal terminology, that my installation complied with all existing regulations and that the association had no grounds to demand its removal. After thorough review of applicable bylaws, property records, and relevant case law, the letter stated, We find no sustainable legal basis for objection to the landscape modifications implemented on Lot 43. The installation meets all horticultural guidelines, setback requirements, and aesthetic standards currently enforceable within Oak Ridge Estates. Most revealing was the paragraph near the conclusion. We strongly advise against pursuing amendment of bylaws with the specific intent to target existing compliant installations, as such actions could expose the association to legal liability for selective enforcement and regulatory overreach. I placed the letter carefully in my documentation binder, adding it to the growing record of this unusual neighborhood conflict. The timing was significant. The annual HOA election was scheduled for the following week, and this professional assessment would undoubtedly influence voter decisions. The election meeting drew record attendance. 98 of the 114 households in Oak Ridge Estates were represented either in person or by proxy, an unprecedented participation rate according to community records. The meeting room at the community center was filled beyond capacity, with residents standing along walls and crowding the entryway. When votes were tallied for board president, the results were decisive. Sandra received only 12 votes out of 98 cast. Her support had collapsed under the weight of legal reality and emerging stories of previous overreach. Thomas Reynolds, the retired attorney who had become the voice of reasonable governance, received 73 votes, with the remainder split among minor candidates. In his brief acceptance speech, Thomas promised a return to sensible governance based on clear rules applied equally to all residents. He specifically mentioned the need for better communication, transparent decision-making, and respect for property rights within the framework of legitimate community standards. Sandra did not remain for the post-election refreshments. Security footage from my driveway camera captured her vehicle speeding past my house that evening, her expression unreadable through the windshield. With the governance issue resolved in favor of reason and proper procedure, I turned my attention to a final refinement of my property situation. After consulting with Eliza, I designed a single, legitimate pathway through the labyrinth, marked with a decorative gate requiring a signed liability waiver stored in a weatherproof box attached to the entry post. The waiver, drafted with input from Marcus to ensure legal soundness, released me from any responsibility for confusion, delay, or frustration experienced within the maze. It acknowledged that the pathway was made available as a courtesy rather than an obligation, and that access could be revoked at any time at the property owner's discretion. Over the following months, exactly 3 residents completed the paperwork. 2 appeared to do so out of genuine curiosity about the maze itself rather than desire for a shortcut. The third was Bill Henderson, who confessed he simply wanted to experience the installation that had transformed neighborhood politics. After navigating the complete path once, he emerged laughing. "Brilliant design," he admitted. "I got lost twice even knowing it was designed to confuse." The community pool now saw residents using the proper pathways that had always existed along public easements. The inconvenience that Sandra had positioned as unbearable amounted to approximately 2 additional minutes of walking along properly maintained sidewalks. Children on bicycles, parents with strollers, and elderly residents with mobility concerns all managed the official route without complaint. As the seasons changed, my labyrinth garden flourished. Spring brought bursts of colorful blooms that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. Summer saw the ornamental grasses reach their full height, creating green walls that swayed gently in the breeze. Fall transformed the installation into a tapestry of amber, crimson, and gold. Even winter had its own stark beauty, with decorative seed heads catching occasional snow and architectural branch structures creating intricate shadows. The transformation extended beyond just aesthetics. My property became something of a neighborhood conversation piece, not as a symbol of conflict, but as an unexpected garden attraction. Several residents asked for the names of particular plants they admired. The garden club requested permission to include photos of certain sections in their annual community calendar. Thomas even suggested installing a small bench on the public sidewalk, adjacent to the maze, so people could appreciate the garden without entering it. 6 months after the election, I was watering my thriving maze garden when movement caught my eye. There was Sandra Power walking along the public sidewalk in her designer athletic wear. She had maintained a low profile since the election, rarely attending community events and never acknowledging me when our paths crossed. She paused briefly at the edge of my property, eyeing the decorative gate that marked the entrance to what had once been her championed shortcut. For a moment she seemed to consider the maze, her head tilting slightly as she examined the flourishing plants and winding pathways visible from the street. Our eyes met across the distance. Something unspoken passed between us, a reckoning, perhaps, or simply resignation. Without changing her expression, she continued along the proper community pathway without a word. That brief encounter marked the final chapter in our property rights dispute. Sandra never again brought up the issue of access through my land. When she eventually sold her home and moved to a different community the following year, not a single reference to the maze controversy appeared in her real estate listing's neighborhood description. Thomas proved to be an effective and fair HOA president. Under his leadership, the board rewrote several ambiguous bylaw sections to provide clearer guidance, established a more transparent approval process for property modifications, and created a formal dispute resolution procedure that did not rely solely on board authority. My labyrinth remained a distinctive feature of my property, evolving and maturing with each passing season. What had begun as a defensive installation transformed into a genuinely beautiful garden that enhanced rather than detracted from neighborhood aesthetics. The original purpose, deterring trespassers, had been achieved, but the installation had ultimately delivered something more valuable, a community reckoning with the proper limits of collective authority over individual rights. 3 years after the maze installation, a feature article in the community newsletter highlighted innovative landscaping throughout Oak Ridge Estates. My property received prominent mention, with photos showcasing the intricate design and diverse plant selections. The article made no mention of the controversy that had prompted its creation. To new residents who had moved in after the events, it was simply an interesting and attractive garden installation. The property line stood respected at last, invisible but now undeniably real. The physical boundary had been defended through creativity rather than confrontation, through compliance rather than conflict. And in that process, other invisible but important lines had been defined as well. The boundaries of authority, the limits of community tradition, and the essential balance between individual rights and collective standards that make neighborhood living both possible and pleasant. As I tended my garden maze on quiet evenings, I sometimes reflected on the strange journey that had transformed a simple property dispute into a community-defining moment. The shortcut that had once divided my yard now existed only in fading memory, replaced by a beautiful installation that added value not just to my property, but to the neighborhood experience itself. The uninvited guests had found their proper path at last, and so, perhaps, had our community.